Read 290. This is Dr. Keisler. This is our lecture for week 4, session 2. I'm sorry that I couldn't make it to class today, but my son is really sick, and so I had to stay home because I couldn't send him to school. So I thought I would just go ahead and we'll do a quick 15-minute lecture here, and this way we won't be behind at all. So the past couple of weeks, what we've really been doing is looking at critical thinking, what critical thinking is. We've looked at some different viewpoints on critical thinking. We've talked about some obstacles to critical thinking, and we've compared or looked at critical thinking as critical reading, since that's what we're going to be doing primarily in this course. So we're just about next week to get started doing a lot of the actual skills involved in critical thinking, but I thought that I would kind of sum up everything that we've been doing so far with the work that you've been doing on your definitions of critical thinking. So what we're going to do today is think about all of those different aspects of critical thinking that we've explored so far in an effort to kind of better understand the process and to develop our own definitions. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a model of adult development that discusses the cognitive skills involved in the critical thinking process and the dispositions necessary to make critical thinking possible. So this is kind of a good theoretical model that ties together all of the things that we've discussed so far, and it's called the Perry model. So we know that an important aspect of critical thinking deals with your view of the source and the nature of knowledge. Some students believe that knowledge comes to them from authorities, that there's a definite right and wrong answer, and that it's their responsibility to work hard and study to get this knowledge from the authority. Others believe that authorities know the facts, but that some areas are matters of opinion, and that all opinions are equally acceptable. And then there's still others that believe that there is no absolute truth, and that we must always be weighing and comparing information to construct that knowledge for ourselves. So in the Perry model, William Perry, who was an English professor at Harvard University, he was the director of the Harvard Study Center, and he did this longitudinal study. And he came up with a model of adult intellectual developmental levels. His theory assumes that development occurs through interaction with others, and that it is sequential, hierarchical, and irreversible, meaning that once you pass through the different levels, you don't go backwards. So the Perry model has 9 stages, which fall into these 4 major categories. So those are dualism, multiplicity, relativism, and commitment within relativism. For our purposes, it's not important that we know all 9 stages. We're just going to focus on the 4 categories. So the first stage is dualism. So within dualism, there's this idea that knowledge is absolute, authority is the source of knowledge, that it's the authority's responsibility to provide true knowledge, and that facts and right answers are desired. So adults operating at this stage, they believe that knowledge is quantitative. In other words, they believe kind of how many facts they know determines how smart they are. And so this semester, we're kind of attempting to move beyond this stage. So, as you acquire the new thinking skills, you want to be able to use the facts that you learn to help construct that knowledge for yourself. The next stage is called multiplicity. And at this level, diversity of opinion is recognized, in that multiple perspectives on both true knowledge and morality exist. There's this sense that all opinions are deemed equally valid, since no known absolute answer exists. And that authority represents a perspective, but that perspective has no greater validity than any others. So we're striving to kind of develop those skills needed to evaluate this diversity of opinions and to either accept or reject them based on the evidence presented in reasonable arguments. And so this is kind of what we've been talking about so far. In relativism, knowledge is viewed as relative, socially constructed, and determined by context. So opinions are viewed kind of as unsupported assertions of belief, and essentially these opinions are deemed worthless. So, there'll remain some matters about which, reasonable people will disagree, but with support in the form of argument, evidence, and consistent logic, opinions then move from being just opinions to positions. So we've kind of talked about this idea before, that everybody has an opinion, but it becomes a position once you have that evidence and the logic piece in there. So an individual is then considered relativistic with respect to a particular subject if they can articulate those arguments for their various positions, but they haven't necessarily made a commitment to a particular point of view until they move into the final stage, which is commitment within relativism. So at this level, knowledge is viewed as qualitative and it's dependent on context. Individuals who've reached the stage examine a question in depth and eventually can make a judgment on it. So although a commitment is made, the individual will still remain open to hearing significant new evidence that might constitute grounds for them re-examining the decision or the position that they've held previously. So I've asked you twice so far this semester to look at or work on your own definition of critical thinking. So I thought that I would share with you the definition of critical thinking that the Cal State Fullerton Read 290 faculty has come up with. After thinking about what we teach and what we've done in terms of critical thinking, we've come up with this as our definition. So critical thinking is a sophisticated process which includes skills, dispositions, and metacognition. Specifically, critical thinking is a disciplined, self-directed, reasonable, and reflective thinking that one performs when deciding what to believe or do. It is purposeful, self-regulatory judgment which results in interpretation, analysis, evaluation, and inference, as well as advocacy of one's position. It is the art of thinking about one's own thinking in order to make it better, more clear, and more accurate. Critical thinkers are open-minded, flexible, and persistent. It is evidenced by the ability and disposition to improve one's thinking by systematically subjecting it to intellectual self-assessment. So that's the definition that we've come up with as a faculty, and that's kind of our perspective on what critical thinking is. So as part of your class participation for today's session, since we're not in class, I would like you to go back to that definition that I've asked you to work on twice so far. And I'd like you to bring it to class on Tuesday ready to turn in. So it doesn't need to be an absolutely, perfect definition, but think about what you've worked on the past 2 times we've spent a little time on it. Maybe spend a little more time on it, considering what you just heard about the Perry model, and come up with, what critical thinking is to you. What is your definition of it? So you can turn it in. It can be handwritten. That's fine, as long as I can read it. But bring it to class on Tuesday for part of the class participation from today. So we spent lots of time now talking about critical thinking. So now we're going to actually get into the doing part of it, right? So we've kind of conceptualized it, we're defining it, and now we're going to start from here on out getting into the doing. So the first kind of doing piece that I'm going to have you do is thinking about point of view. So in terms of critical reading and critical thinking, we want to think about language, right? So the way that we express point of view through the words that we choose to use when we speak or when we write something. So every time then we read something, we need to be thinking about point of view, because whoever wrote that piece that we are now reading used certain language or chose certain words to express their point of view. So you may also think of this as kind of the author's perspective or persuasion, right? So one of the kind of underlying concepts in point of view is this idea that you're choosing language to persuade, right? So we use persuasive language because we want to convince others to agree with our facts, to share our values, and to accept our arguments and conclusions, and essentially adopt our way of thinking. So there are lots of different ways that you can kind of persuade people. And one of those is by setting a particular tone and using particular words that, can appeal to either things they already know, the biases they have. But those words are can also, demonstrate the biases and the attitudes about the subject that the author is bringing to it. So we're going to look at some use of language or use of point of view and author's perspective in some reporting in the form of newspaper articles. So, we assume that newspapers are neutral, but you can still usually pick up on point of view if you're looking closely at the language that's being used by the author. So, whenever there's reporting of an event, there's going to be a point of view, right? Even when we, even in a newspaper where we expect that there's going to be this, certain degree of neutrality, there will be a point of view. So, the writer's feeling about the event, their proximity to the event, their background knowledge about that subject, and their cultural conditioning can all affect the way that they report that event. So one way that we can look at the language used and try to determine an author's point of view is to look at the facts that they highlight, right? One detail might be ignored in one article, and in the next article that's highlighted based on who's writing that particular article. Another strategy is that you can consider the language, right? So the actual words that they choose, because those words can help set the tone. So, for example, an author who's trying to describe a child's behavior in the best possible way might decide to describe the child as high-spirited or energetic. An author who wants to persuade you differently or has different feelings or experience or cultural conditioning regarding that child's behavior might describe that same child and their behavior as unruly or lacking in discipline. So this is an example of how, word choice can influence how you look at the reporting or the article or the description that you're about to read. So here's a couple of other examples. Do they say something like a near miss or a near hit? Do they say fatally wounded or do they say killed? Do they describe the event as a bombing raid or a protective incursion? Do they say it's the Department of War or the Department of Defense, right? A janitor or a sanitation engineer. So all of those are describing the exact same event, concept, or person, but the words that you choose changes or influences the tone of the piece and the writing, and can persuade people in different ways to kind of accept what's being written about. So what I'm going to have you do is, if you go onto Titanium, you'll see that there are 9 little excerpts of coverage from the assassination of Malcolm X. So they're from all different, major publications. So I'd like you to go ahead and take those and read all of them. And as you read them, think about, are there particular facts or particular words that they're choosing to use and highlight that would lead you to believe that that author was either supportive of Malcolm X and his efforts, that they are neutral, they have no opinion or not trying to persuade you either way, about Malcolm X and his efforts, or they have a negative or not supportive view of Malcolm X and his efforts. So bring this to class with you on Tuesday. I'm going to ask that you just read those. You can highlight and pull out a few words, and then you'll see on the last page there's just a little chart, and it asks you to say, which ones you think were supportive, which ones you kind of think based on the language used were neutral, and which ones you think are not supportive. And then we will discuss that on class on Tuesday. So bring in your definition of critical thinking, bring in this Malcolm X exercise, and thank you for being understanding that we did not have class today. So have a good weekend.